Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to The Intelligent Community, the podcast of the Intelligent Community Forum. I'm Lou Zaccarella, one of the founders. Today, we continue our series, Policing the Intelligent Community. This episode is brought to you by the ICF organizations in Canada and Taiwan. Today, we are going to go to the province of Ontario, Canada, and the city of Hamilton, one of the world's top 7 intelligent communities in 2020, for a discussion about what our guest calls the crisis in cities of the marginalized triangle. So what is that? Well, I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the convergence of crises that have produced an absolute fissure within communities that people expect their police force to deal with. And police, already under enormous pressure in the COVID era, may be the least equipped people to actually do it. But intelligent communities and their police find a way to innovate into a solution. We may have found one in Hamilton, which is a steel town being transformed by the ICF method, as many of you know. And so what we're going to do today is speak with a unique and creative practitioner of law enforcement who has spent the last 2 decades on the streets looking at communities in a way that few of us are able to do. Sergeant Pete Weisner is the sergeant of the Crisis Response Branch within the Hamilton Police Service. And you will learn more about that organization and what it does today in this area of innovation. Sergeant Pete has been reimagining policing in the public square and thinking about results on a human-to-human level through posts as a correctional officer, on uniformed patrol and vice and drugs, and most recently as the supervisor of a special unit called the Social Navigator program. And that's what we want to know more about today. So it's here that we think the greatest lessons for communities may reside. So we invited Sergeant Pete to come on, probably during his lunch hour, and take us through his innovation and talk about policing the intelligent community. Sergeant Pete Weisner, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Lou. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's great to see you, and we really appreciate you making the time today. Well, let's start with some of the basics. A lot of our followers know about Hamilton because it has been an intelligent community. We've talked with the mayor and others up there, but give us a sense of what's really going on. What's the situation like where you are today on the streets of Hamilton and in the community? And second question, what's been the most significant insight for you as you do your job over the past years, the year of COVID?
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about Hamilton. I'm born and raised in Hamilton. I've spent my entire 45 years of my life in Hamilton, policing, like you said, for 20 years and in corrections for 5 before that. So I can speak from my experience of being both a police officer and a correctional officer in Hamilton, and the transition that Hamilton has made from that, the nitty gritty steel town of the 80s to what it is now. And interestingly enough, it's not as gritty as people once thought it was. It's taken on a new life and a new form, but with that and with change and reform comes new problems and of course new strategies that need to be deployed for these problems. And one of the things that we can say that has hit Hamilton harder than most communities, especially in our direct area in Southern Ontario, is the amount of marginalized and vulnerable people that to some degree have flocked to Hamilton because of the vortex of which Hamilton draws people in because of their elaborate supports that they have in place for those marginalized in the city. And it's very something to be proud to be a part of, knowing that there are people out there that need that human touch and need that ability to have that a little bit of navigation in their life, whether it's getting hooked up with supports financially or drug addiction supports, mental health supports, and of course homeless supports. But what we have as a police service have done over the last 23 years has really cultivated the culture of reform in the way we lead policing in our community.
Yeah.
And what that is giving back to some sectors of the private sector, so to speak, to work with us. So for example, our Coast and MCERT teams, which are mental health teams, have a direct relationship with our mental health first hospital St. Joseph's, Healthcare Hamilton, and they are actually deployed with our police officers to deal with persons in crisis, for example. And that's been going on for the better part of 23 years in Hamilton.
Yeah, let me stop you there, Sergeant, because again, you're starting now to talk about the social navigator program
And parts of it, correct.
and parts of it. And again, the thinking behind that is that this is a more collaborative approach.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of where the innovation is, as far as we're concerned. I mean, we haven't seen it in too many places. So maybe if we can talk a little bit about the Social Navigator program, because the way you have evolved that there, it's now part, as you say, of the basic infrastructure of the city. So, tell us about your job, basically,
Sure.
and the history of the Social Navigator.
Absolutely. So the Social Navigator program is a partnership between the Hamilton Police Service and the Hamilton Emergency Services, so paramedics, and they deploy paramedics to work with our police officers, and of course our very brilliant Social Navigator coordinator, Sandra Kurtzil. And essentially, what we're tasked with is to connect and support individuals throughout the community through a referral process by engaging all of the other social agencies and healthcare agencies in the city of Hamilton. And specifically, why we do that is to reduce the reliance of the judicial and healthcare systems by navigating those clients towards the appropriate agency while improving the health, safety, and quality of life for all of the citizens in the community. So that in a nutshell brings us to where we were with the marginalized triangle. I know that's quite a
Yeah,
fascinating. Go
yeah.
ahead.
I want to, I want to stop because we've got people listening who have never heard this concept before, and they're taking notes for their own cities. So I want to make sure that they get it from the source here.
Sure.
Um, the question, of course, begs itself: how does the police force, with so much on its plate, manage this compounding program where you've got a lot of other elements brought in that aren't necessarily directly related to crime as we would define it?
So kind of the interesting piece to this is that um, presently, right now, we're talking about mental health, and I'm sure this is very similar down in the US. Legislation has given police the authority to apprehend individuals who are in mental health crises, for example. And thus, when there's somebody who's experiencing a personal crisis, a person in crisis, as we call them here in Canada, we are deployed as police officers to assist with that individual to determine whether they meet the criteria to be apprehended and thus brought to a mental health facility for further analysis. Um, Police get involved with, as a social navigator program, for example, these are the challenges that we have with certain individuals in the community that don't have the wraparound supports. And what they end up doing is they become a high user of our service and a high user of emergency service, for example. So they do call 911 to get help for what they feel to be a crisis. And it could be something that could be drug induced. It could be a social issue, homelessness, for example, and it causes them undue stress, and it causes them to act the way they do, at which point police are now called because there's people within the city are asking or reporting to police that, hey, this guy's in crisis, we need to go help him. So the reality is, what we're trying to do is we're going to get called to that call anyway. So let's just use John Doe's in the middle of King Street, and he's lifting up sewer grates. Not necessarily a police issue because he's addicted to a substance and he has mental health issues. But people are calling on police to go and react to that individual. And the reality is, we're the only real safety net in place to ensure that nobody's going to get hurt. We're mitigating risk, making sure that um, the right agencies are brought into it. But the reality is this a police issue? Is dealing with somebody who is experiencing mental health crisis really a police issue? And the answer is no all the time. And there's one of the slides I included there, and I've heard this from one of my presentations, is that every emergency is a crisis, but not every crisis is an emergency. And
Yeah,
what I
I,
mean
I
by
I saw that. I think that's a
yeah,
great line. That's very appropriate.
Yeah, and what I mean by that is that I'll use as a example. Let's assume I have a family member living in my house, and I need to call police, or they're dealing with a mental health crisis, and I'm trying to help them get through it. And right now, that is a crisis. That's a personal crisis in my household, or my family, or my friends. But when it gets larger than something I could deal with, the right people are called in, and that's police at the time. And essentially every time police are called to a crisis, we turn that crisis into an emergency, which is
Hmm.
fine at times because that crisis might determine the fact that we need to ramp this up to be an emergency. We might have to bring this person to hospital. But there's times where there's very highly trained mental health workers and social workers and occupational therapists that work with us regularly through our St. Joe's program with M Certain Coast that are have much more expertise than we as frontline police officers have. And this is where we want to draw on the strengths of those who have that skill set in place in order to work with us to
Right.
roll out that service.
Right. And so that, I think, leads us to your concept of the marginalized triangle, where
That's
mental
correct.
health is one piece of that. And so,
Mhm.
if you could take us through what that actually means, and of course, we've got a slide that we'll put up to show that, and then again, how that collaboration actually works, because I'm sure it's easier said than done.
Of course. So I'm going to just take you back 20 years. When I first got onto my as a police officer in Hamilton, I worked in our central division, so it's like downtown Times Square type of location. Um, and having worked at the jail, I knew who the players were, and I saw what the basement of Hamilton looked like. Every city has a basement where those people go, and nobody really sees them, and nobody really wants to talk about them. And then I became the social navigator prior to becoming the supervisor here. And I realized that Hamilton doesn't have a basement, and most cities, for that sake, have beyond a basement. They have sub basements that people don't even know about. People who live so rough, and people who live with such disdain for the system, where they don't know how to get out of that rut they're in. And it really makes yourself, not as a police officer, open your eyes, but as a human being, open your eyes and go, wow, I would have never thought that people live like this. And the reality is, Lou, 10 years ago, I was working in vice and drugs, kicking indoors and loving life. And, given the ability and the responsibility to work in a unit like this, which 10 years ago, I would have never thought I would be doing,
Right.
you actually realize that, hey, you can help people out, but more than just going to a school and giving a presentation or helping this kid, fix his bike on the side of the road. There's people out there that don't even know how to navigate themselves to go and get social assistance or to get a warm blanket at night or to get food in their stomach, right? And it's not necessarily a police responsibility to do because that's not a police problem. However, it's incumbent on us to be a part of that solution. And that's what we want to do.
Why is it incumbent upon the police sergeant to be a part of that solution? I think I
Because it,
understand it at a
yeah,
human level, but
yeah,
please.
because at 3 o'clock in the morning, when there's nobody else out there, and Joe Blow is in a mental health crisis because maybe he's in the middle of a drug-induced psychosis episode, and he's on our Bay Street ripping up sewer grates, we are responding. We are the primary response, the emergency response to deal with that individual at that time, right?
Hmm.
And we know from our experiences of having to deal with this individual maybe multiple times in the night or multiple times in a week, what would be best suited to help that individual. And this is where the expertise of some great pieces that we have in our social navigator program come to be able to marry up the pieces of this individual who doesn't know how to navigate himself. Well, guess what? Sandra, our coordinator, knows every agency in the city, and we have a foot in our door with it, and we can cut the red tape to to access these services more rapidly for these individuals that need that help.
Right. So you've created this system, and it's really interesting because I'm looking at some of the statistics from Hamilton. With regard to the marginalized triangle, the addiction, mental health, and
Mhm.
homelessness are the three components. Um, Demographically, they all seem to break out into about the same percentage of the people you saw. And we're looking at 2020 now.
Mhm.
76% were homeless. I think 75% struggled with mental addiction. 56 had a concurrent disorder. Um, I mean, these things break out almost evenly across the board.
They sure
It's
do.
almost like this a similar percentage of the population. What's going on there? What do you?
So COVID, and like right across the world, as we've all experienced, has added a new level of obstacles that we do have to overcome. And of course, there's larger cities in Hamilton like LA and New York that we keep our finger on the pulse with about the homeless populations.
Mm,
And in Hamilton, we experienced a very unique incident last year where we had a very large amount of people living rough, as we call it in Hamilton, or encampments, as we call it. And the reality is that sometimes there's not enough sustainable housing options for people who are marginalized, that are looking for, affordable rent, or places where it's just not about getting in the front door of a affordable place to live, but it's about having those wraparound supports. We can get funding and strategies to help this very marginalized individual get into a house, but how do they support themselves when they're there? And the reality is, if we don't wrap the support around this individual, what happens is they become problematic to themselves and to others, and it requires an emergency response by police to deal with, whether it be drug-induced psychosis, or a mental health crisis, or anything in between that. And essentially, by dealing with them before they're in crisis, we're going to alleviate the amount of time we're actually spending on them after the fact, when they've been able to have been, wrapped around by the supports that we have in the community, and just not police supports. And that's the best thing about the Social Navigator program, is that we have made a lot of inroads and built a lot of bridges to different agencies in our community that, 2 years ago, people didn't really see the value of what it, of working with police, and wow, they're police officers and they see that uniform. And it's not until people actually see who's behind that uniform and what they're able to do as a police officer, as a coordinator of the program, or as a paramedic who work directly with our Social Navigator program can do. And it actually warms my heart when I have people calling me 2 years after the fact, when they were staunch proponents of our, police and Social Navigator programs, where 2 years later they're like, wow, I can't believe the type of work you do. And this is from technically speaking, people on the left side of the fence who, strongly advocated for police to remove themselves from certain things. And we understand that, but the reality is we can't, because we're mandated by law to continue to do it. But they see the way we engage with our client base, and needless to say, they are overwhelmed to the point they actually want to create partnerships with us now, because they understand the value of what we bring to their table as well.
By any definition, that's reform. I
That's
mean,
right.
any mayor listening to this, any police force in the world would say, yeah, that's the change that I want. So by investing up front, you do get that return on investment. I know personally, things that I've heard and read about you. I mean, you go out there on the street, and people look at you differently. You are the guy. You're the popular guy in a crowd, wherever you go. So you've turned something around, and somebody said something really interesting, and I want you to elaborate on it if you can.
Sure.
They said it was so simple. They said the difference was he actually looked me in the eye. Do you remember that story?
Yeah, there's a couple. I could share a couple of really interesting case studies with you, if you will. And I
But
had a.
yeah, but it's such a simple thing, Pete.
It is, and it.
And I actually was walking on the streets in New York with my parish priest one time, talking to, we have a homeless shelter here, and he said, sometimes don't give money, don't give food, look them in the eye, acknowledge them, maybe say a few words of prayer when you walk away. He said it
Mhm.
actually does make a difference. Was he telling me the truth?
You're absolutely right. I think you take somebody, and I don't, somebody who's been homeless for 20 years, they've been out panhandling for 10 years, addiction and mental health and homelessness and all this other stuff. And nobody, unless, and I think everybody out there, it goes back to 20 years ago, nobody admitted they were schizophrenic. Nobody admitted they had a mother who was, mental health issues and stuff like that. And the ability to bring that to the forefront and deter people from looking at it as a con, or looking at it as something to be ashamed of, where now the people I engage with, yeah, I don't need to remind them they're homeless, and I don't need to remind them that they're, like they don't. I have individuals like, I don't want the help because I don't deserve the help, but I have to question them, like, well, why don't you deserve help? Because you got dealt a bad deck of cards or a bad hand at this time. There's things in place, there's systems in place to help individuals like that, and a lot of them don't want the help, in the sense like maybe they don't deserve it. And
Mm,
sometimes it takes somebody like me to go up to them, like, you know what, you're a human being still. And I had a young fella I dealt with a couple of years ago. He's on one of the slides there, and if I could just take you through it real quick.
sure.
He was homeless, never had any positive interactions with police, and he was brought to my attention because we had dealt with him so many times over the course of a 30-day period. And once I did some research into it and I realized who he was, because I didn't know who he was, I was just brought to my attention. And I realized that 183 hours of police work had been put into this individual's care, if you will, resulting in 43 incidents that police had to respond to him in a 30-day period. So I eventually ran into him, and different when you're in person, and you get down to their level, and you're like, hey, I want to help you. What
Right.
do you need from me so we don't have to respond to deal with you 30 times or 43 times in a 30-day period? And he was quite coy with me and said, I need to find a place to live. And I said, no problem. In Hamilton, we have a YMCA shelter, and it's one of the last ones in Canada, if I'm not mistaken, that still house homeless males or people looking for housing. And it's very affordable, $427. And we created a great partnership with the YMCA 4 years ago. We were able to utilize some of these bed spots. So I told this fella, hey, come with me. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to pick you up. And he jumped into the minivan I was driving that the next day and kind of looked at me like I had a toaster on my head, because he's never, here I am in full uniform and he's driving around shotgun with a cop now. Usually he's in the back seat.
Right. Well, and you said he was anti-police.
Yeah, yeah. In a
Right.
sense, like he didn't know what to expect, but now he realized, okay, nobody else has helped me. I've got nothing to lose, right? Like,
Right.
so first thing I said to him was, hey, you like coffee? Let's go get a coffee, break the ice. And with some of the systems we have in place in Hamilton, like we have an outreach place, Value Village is called, where they allow us to go in and get donated clothing for these people. We went to our local OW, which is our public works office, to get him set up on social assistance, which he wasn't. And we got him signed up at the YMCA into a room at the YMCA all in the same day. And the interesting part of this story is that I remember him looking over to me and said, I don't understand what's going on here. Of course, with some expletives, but he's like, why are you helping me? Explain. And I said, do you want the truth or do you want reality? And I'll never forget this conversation. He goes, I want the truth. And I said, well, here's the truth. We dealt with you 43 times in a 30-day period, resulting in 183 police hours put into dealing with you, breaking windows and melting down and all this other stuff. And you told me yesterday, all you needed was a place to live, and I got you that place. And he looked at me, he's like, yeah, but that's the truth. What's the reality? And I said, the reality is you're a human being and you deserve to get some supports that are in place. And it all goes back to that marginalized triangle. And for me, fundamentally, the most important thing on that marginalized triangle is that homelessness piece. When you have somebody who doesn't know how to log or doesn't have a door to just close themselves off from the world and enjoy some sanctity and some peace, when you don't have that homeless piece, then you're gonna you get back into the addiction side of things. Maybe they're dealing with addiction and they don't want to be in a shelter, they don't want to be in a tent on the street, or they don't want to be around people who are using, because it's going to cause them to use more.
Right.
And when you use drugs, you jump to the other side of that triangle. Now you're playing with the mental health side of things. And does that drug use cause psychosis? And it all, for me at least, it funnels back down to homelessness. And if it's a simple piece of just putting somebody into a lodging home, putting somebody into a shelter bed, or in this case the YMCA, where they have closure, I can close my door and give myself some rest and recuperation and become a better human being. And they all want it. Nobody wants to be a bad human being. I don't think
Right.
anybody inherently says, I want to be a bad person today. But when you haven't had food and you haven't had shelter and you're dealing with mental health issues, you can't be a good person, or you can't be the best person you can be, because you're struggling to find these other pieces of your life, which causes, of course, undue stress. And this is where that marginalized triangle, it just keeps going. You don't have
Right.
homeless, and it just keeps going around and around.
Yeah, it's interesting, Sergeant, because we talk a lot about bandwidth, right, at the ICF, but we often mean it on the technology side. Do you have enough broadband?
Mhm.
Do you have enough?
That's
But
correct.
you're also talking about psychic bandwidth that your programs are creating, where people can try to find enough space to, to clean things up.
Hmm.
Um, I've got so many questions, but one is, you said you grew up in Hamilton. I don't know your background or what you were like when you were young, but how did it get to this point in our communities where now it's been left on the doorstep of guys like you to say, I've got to innovate a program here. I've got to figure this out because it's really bad. And I
Hmm.
notice even in 2021, your referrals are up way over
Hmm.
the average again.
Yeah. I think, especially for 2020, I think every city struggles with the pandemic that the world kind of threw at us, and really no time to plan, and the fact of what economically, the challenges that people encounter now with, evictions and not being able to afford, simple rent and stuff like that has allowed for the increased homelessness population to rise. Um, but the reality speaking is that I think, and I'm going to speak in Hamilton, we have such a dedicated group of individuals in this. We have a service of over 800 police officers. Our population in Hamilton's over 500,000 people, but it's still such a small town. Everybody still
Mm.
knows everybody. And it's hard to say when you have 500,000 people, everybody
Yeah.
still knows everybody. And it comes to full circle when I walk out of the front of the police station, and I could go in on a 15 block radius walk and run into individuals I see all the time and check in on them. And our our social navigators and our action teams have that ability to engage very positively with these individuals in the city, that they're starting to realize that police are here to help. I think the different things that have come out of the world in the last year, with what's gone on in Minnesota and the Black Lives Matter movement, and the different variables about police kind of relinquishing some of their abilities to deal with those mental health crises that people are involved with. We're huge proponents of that. We understand that there has to be reform, and one thing I'm a huge proponent on is reform. And the definition of reform, or by definition, is to change something typically in a social, political, or economic institution in order to improve it. And I think a lot of people, with the defund police movement and all this other thing, the reality is, do we really want to defund police? And I think the majority of the population understand the value that is there. But is there a time for reform in policing? I think the answer is yes. And reform doesn't mean we're doing something wrong. It just means we have to do something better. And we have
Right.
to change with the times. And the times are, there's more homelessness, there's more homeless, there's more marginalized, there's more concurrent disorders with mental health and addiction, that we have to step back, relook at the larger picture and say, okay, how can we deal with this situation better in order for everybody to appreciate and respect where the police run on this? It's not us trying to go out and marginalize people any further or make them even more vulnerable. It's about pulling them out of the situation they're in and getting their lives a little bit better, one person at a time.
Yeah, and bringing them back to the community, as you've also said. And to that, when we talk about the marginalized triangle, which part of it do you think needs to really sort of collapse and shrink first for the rest of it to kind of improve? Would it be the mental health element or the
Unequivocally,
homelessness?
yeah, I would say homelessness, and the reason I say that, like, they're all viable
And they're all
avenues in
terrible.
which
Yeah,
they're all terrible. Being
yeah,
homeless, if you were to say which one would you rather suffer from, I'd say none, because being
yeah. Of
homelessness
course.
would be just as bad as being a drug addict, which would be just as bad as somebody dealing with schizophrenia, right? So there's no good answer here. But the reality is, I think that when you can control somebody's ability to give back to themselves and to have ownership of something, when they are homeless, they might have a tent, they might have a shelter bed, but it's not theirs. It's not something they can call home. And if we had the ability to get somebody into a room at the YMCA, for example, we've seen their ability to improve their psychosis, their drug use, their mental health, everything in between. Homelessness is really where I think the stability lies for people who are dealing within that marginalized triangle.
Hmm. Hmm. Now, just as we wrap it up, you've really triggered a lot of partnerships, which I think is the genius of intelligent communities. We see this all around the world. Wherever we go, the underlying a lot of their success is their ability to collaborate. And we find that actually Canada seems to do it better than a lot of other places in the world. And I'm never quite sure why, but it's a good thing. Don't change it, right? Keep skating the way you're skating.
Right.
Um, how important are those partnerships, and how do you put them together from your seat as the director of the Navigator program?
Um, well, I'd be remiss if I didn't say how incredibly dedicated our entire team is, and more importantly, how dedicated our command staff is with understanding the value of what our program does, and who and how we uh, push it out to the community. Um, but the reality is that whether it be in Hamilton or Toronto or anywhere else in Ontario, these issues are going to continue to happen. There's no magic medication or magic pill or magic anything that we could do, except utilize the resources that we already have in place. And like I said, in Hamilton, we have an incredible amount of non-for-profits in Hamilton, agencies like the Mission, um, that are able. Mission Services is one of our partnering agencies where we can call on them. They have addiction specialists, they have housing specialists, where when we're out dealing with that person in the community, they're a phone call away, or we could email them and say, hey, listen, we got some great partnerships already. Let's see what we could do, our
Hmm.
partnership with the Y. But the reality is we can do it better, I think. And I think by doing it better is actually partnering up and actually being deployed with social workers. And people look at that and they go, wow, why would a social worker go out with a police officer? Like, what value do you have behind that? The reality is that some social workers are smarter and more equipped to deal with the social issues that present themselves to police. And the partnerships that we've created with our social navigator program with John Howard and court mandated clients and Good Shepherds and Wesley Housing Services have been incredible, to the point that they understand the value that we now bring to their agency. Because with police, you can cut a lot of red tape. You can go in and deal with an
Mm.
individual and kind of like, if we go and call the YMCA and, like, do you have any rooms tonight? And, well, yeah, but why? Well, because we have somebody, and we're actually going to support this individual here, because if we can get them in there, we don't want to see, we don't, first of all, we don't want to make that your problem. We understand that there still has to be wraparound supports for this individual. But the key is, like I said, in that marginalized triangle, getting them off the streets or her off the streets into something that they can just take a deep breath and say, okay, I can start to navigate myself. And
Yeah.
with all the different individuals I've helped, my motto is help me, help you. and
Right.
and whether they toe the line 5%, we will help pick up the pieces behind you and pull it all together. But the people we help are the ones that realize, okay, like that one case study I showed you before, where yeah, all I need is a house. Okay, well, if you're willing to come with me that next day to help you, and keeping in mind he has no clue what to expect when he jumps in a minivan with a police officer, like,
Right.
yeah,
And, and again, the power of the police being used in a way that, again, is socially good, and you don't have to spend those, what is it, 183 hours
mhm,
anymore on that individual, and that's huge for your job. And on one of your slides, you had a great cartoon, which I think sort of sums up where this is all headed if we all do it right. And it was a street person holding up a sign saying, "Keep your coins, I want change."
that's correct. And
I love that.
it's one of the slides that we actually quite use a bit. It's on our conclusion slide there. But um, like I said, the person holding that sign on the street didn't have ambitions 20 years ago when they were in grade 3, saying, hey, I want to be a homeless guy on the
Right.
streets of New York or the streets of Hamilton begging for money. Nobody had that expectation when they were in grade 3. But the reality is some people end up like that. And it could be your mother, it could be my sister, it could be Matt's cousin. Everybody knows somebody. And I alluded to this before when we talked about the stigmas of mental health 20 years ago. Nobody admitted my
Mm,
mom was schizophrenic, or my dad was
right.
bipolar, or my sister was this.
That's right.
But now people are openly talking about it. And I think things are starting to change when it comes to homelessness, because it's not about homeless. It's not that guy's homeless on the corner and we got to deal with it. Let's get to the bottom infrastructure of
Right.
why
It's
is
not that
that
he
guy
didn't work hard
homeless.
enough, or that
Yeah.
God didn't love him better than anybody
Hmm.
else, or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pete, final question. Keep your coins, I want change. When you look down the road over the next 5 years at cities around the world, because you're a keen observer of my city, New York, and others as
Hmm.
well, what do you think is going to be the most significant change in policing coming out
Um,
of all this?
well, I'd hope to say that it would happen in Hamilton first, like it has been, or we have been the gold standard across Canada. 23 years ago, not invented, but we had a crisis in Hamilton, which was a result of a homicide of a 2.5-year-old boy named
Hmm.
Matthew Antidormi.
That's right.
And that was what created the Coast program. We realized that, yeah, we can go to this person's house and deal with mental health crisis, but at the end of the day, there's still going to be tragedy and there's still going to be things that happen. And the only way, or the way they resolved that, was by bringing in non-police, civilian mental health workers to work hand in hand with police to respond to mental health crisis calls. That's what we've done for mental health for the last 23 years. And since the pandemic started, I had a little list on my board. I've had 27 different agencies reach out to me to ask about how can we do it better in the city we're in. I've had, as far away as Ireland, I've had cities from across the US reach up here, because we are the gold standard of what we do with that. we want to be the gold standard in Hamilton again with our social navigator program and being
Mm-hmm.
able to utilize we're doing the job anyways. Let's just do it more efficiently.
Right.
So when we, as a social navigator team, comes up to somebody who's marginalized, drug addict, homeless, whatever, we can say, okay, guess what? We have a partner with us right beside us who are able to help us deal with this non-police issue, although be it an issue that police should still be a part of the solution with, but they are much more equipped. So I would love to see the private sector, not to say let's privatize policing, but the
Right.
partnership with agencies that are dealing with this marginalized person. We're dealing with this marginalized person. Let's bring it together and effectively strategize to make this person's life quicker and deal with them rapid intervention successfully.
Right. So in other words, the change could very well be we see more social navigator type programs in other cities because it is so obviously the way forward.
100%. And I
Yeah.
think that once society starts to realize that police are in the business of wanting to help and support individuals, and the way we do that is by reaching out to get those expertise that deal with this. And again, we get back to that R word nobody likes to say, reform.
Mm-hmm.
Reform's not a bad thing. It's just changing something you do to make it better. And if that means we have to bring in people to help us deploy better and to get to the under infrastructure of why that guy's standing on the corner saying he wants change but not coins,
Right.
that's when we're going to do good business.
Yeah, that's well said. Well, listen, Sergeant Pete Weisner, I know you got about 30 cops out there, waiting to talk or get in the room or something. They're ready to go. Listen, I really want to thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. It was a pleasure being here, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to showcase what we do here in Hamilton.
Well, you guys are doing a great job, and obviously we're going to point the more intelligent communities at you as their police forces start asking questions. So again, be prepared to keep teaching.
I appreciate it, and we will.
All right. Well, thanks again. And for more information on the City of Hamilton, visit investhamilton.ca. Many thanks to ICF Canada and ICF Taiwan for their support. And you can learn more about us and them at intelligentcommunity.org. This series is produced as a service to the network of intelligent communities and movement followers across the world. Shout out to our series producer, Matt Owen, and a shout out to our new Smart 21 cities that were named in February at our Smart 21 conference. For more information about them and to learn from them, go to intelligentcommunity.org/smart21 and follow us on Twitter and New Communities and on Facebook. For the Intelligent Community Podcast and for Sergeant Pete Weisner of Hamilton, Ontario, I'm Lou Zaccarella, reminding you that there really is no place like home. Take care, everybody.